Sometimes you never truly know how you'll react until you're in the situation yourself. I've often read about people who seem to have all the answers, yet somehow they end up on opposite sides of the same issue. I grew up in a broken home. My mom and dad argued constantly, and one day my dad walked out on us. I was 9 at the time, too young to fully understand what was happening. I had an older brother and sister, but they had already moved out by then. My brother was 21 and my sister 19. Both were in college. Now they're married and live in different states. I only see them during the holidays or when they visit on vacation. They're not very close to Mom anymore, especially since she got remarried. From what I understand, I was what some might call a love child. My parents had me in an attempt to save their marriage. I guess it worked for a while, but soon enough their arguing and bickering started up again. The final straw came when Dad found out Mom had cheated on him. She said it was because he had cheated on her years earlier. It turned into a toxic cycle of betrayal. One day, during one of their heated arguments, Mom blurted out that I might not even be Dad's biological son. She said it in the heat of the moment, but Dad decided to get a DNA test. When the results came back, it confirmed that he wasn't my biological father. Both Mom and Dad were shocked. The very next day, at 9 a.m., Dad filed for divorce. He was the only dad I had ever known. Even though he worked all the time and we weren't very close, he was still my dad. After the divorce, we talked occasionally, but it was never the same. When I asked Mom about my biological father, she told me she wasn't sure. She had always assumed it was Dad. Life became harder for me after that. I later learned that Mom had been something of a party girl when she was younger. She married young and had my brother and sister before she was 21. After that, she started going out with some of her coworkers while Dad was on the road. He was a truck driver and often away from home. It turns out they both cheated on each other repeatedly. After the divorce, Mom didn't remarry until I was 18, but she did bring a number of men home. Usually, she did this when I was at a friend's house or staying with my grandparents. I never saw any of them stay the night when I was home. That brings me to my own marriage. I got married when I was 22. I met Marin at the lumberyard where I worked. She was a secretary there. I asked her out, and we quickly became friends before transitioning into a romantic relationship. Within a year, we were married. Marin was always very flirty, but I thought it was just her personality. She seemed to be friends with everyone. When we first met, she was 20 and claimed to be a virgin. To be honest, I wasn't entirely sure if that was true, but I believed her at the time. Now, I know the truth. Our life together was what I would call normal. We went to the movies, visited friends and family, and ate out often. Sometimes Marin would cook for us at home, usually simple meals like macaroni and cheese or other easy dishes. I didn't mind because we both worked, and I knew cooking wasn't her strong suit when we were dating. Still, when we went out with friends, I sometimes wondered if Marin had been with other men. It wasn't because of anything she did. It was more about my own insecurities, shaped by my mom's behavior. I didn't want to think that way, but it was always in the back of my mind. I never told Marin much about my mother. Other than that, she dated a lot after the divorce. I certainly never told her that I had been a peeping Tom as a teenager, secretly watching my mother with the men she brought home. That was a part of my life I tried to bury. Our sex life seemed normal to me. The reason we got married so quickly was because Marin got pregnant. When she told me I asked her to marry me, it felt like the right thing to do. I liked her a lot and figured I could grow to love her. Her family, however, hated me from the start. They blamed me for not using protection and getting their daughter pregnant. In their eyes, Marin could do no wrong, and I was constantly fighting an uphill battle. The only person in her family who seemed to like me was her younger sister, Kathy. Kathy was 2 years younger than Marin, quieter, and more reserved. I always had a soft spot for Kathy because she was the only one in the family who talked to me. In her 5th month of pregnancy, Maren had a miscarriage. That was 2 years ago. We've now been married for almost 3 years. I've asked her on several occasions if she's ever been with another man, and she always denies it. During our intimate moments, I've asked if she's ever thought about being with someone else, and she assures me that she doesn't need another man. I'm more than enough for her. Looking back, I realize how young and naive I was. When I graduated high school, my mom's new husband told me it was time for me to move out and be on my own. I found a cheap apartment and got a job to support myself. I was working at the lumberyard and had a pretty decent life going. Like most young men, I was quite interested in women and dated a few girls before I met Maren. We met while I was working at the lumberyard, and once we started dating, things moved quickly. We became lovers and were married within the year. Maren was always the flirty type, but I thought it was just part of her personality. She was friendly with everyone and even claimed to be a virgin when we met. To be honest, I wasn't sure about that then, and now I know the real story. Our life together seemed normal enough. We went to the movies, visited friends and relatives, and ate out about half the time. Occasionally, Maren would cook meals at home, usually simple dishes like macaroni and cheese. I didn't mind, though. We both worked, and I already knew she wasn't much of a cook when we were dating. Still, whenever we went out with friends, I sometimes wondered if Maren had been with other men. I knew this insecurity came from my experiences with my mother's behavior, but even though I didn't want to think that way, the thought was always lodged in my mind. I never told Maren much about my mother, other than casually mentioning that she dated a lot. The last thing I would ever tell my wife was that, as a teenager, I had been a peeping Tom who secretly watched my mother with other men. Our sex life was what I would have considered normal. The reason we got married so quickly was because Maren got pregnant. When she told me, I felt it was the right thing to do, so I asked her to marry me. I liked her a lot and figured I could grow to love her. Her family, however, hated me from the very beginning. They blamed me for not using protection and getting their daughter pregnant. In their eyes, Maren could do no wrong, and I was fighting an uphill battle from day one. The only person in her family who seemed to like me was her younger sister, Kathy. Kathy was 2 years younger than Maren, quieter, and more reserved. Maren, on the other hand, was outgoing and always the center of attention. I always had a soft spot for Kathy because she was the only one in the family who would actually talk to me. In her 5th month of pregnancy, Maren lost the baby. That was 2 years ago. We've now been married for almost 3 years. I've asked Maren on a few occasions if she has ever been with another man, and she always assures me she hasn't. During our intimate moments, I've sometimes asked if she ever thought about being with someone else. She always tells me that she doesn't need another man. I'm more than enough for her. Looking back, I realize how young and naive I was. That brings me to a particular event that happened when we went out of town for her cousin's wedding. The wedding was only 40 miles away in Steubenville, where Maren grew up and graduated from high school. She introduced me to so many people that it felt less like a wedding and more like a high school reunion. We were staying at the motel where the reception was held, so we both drank quite a bit. I told Maren beforehand that I wouldn't stay at her parents' house because they barely talked to me. The trouble began at the wedding reception. Many of Maren's old friends wanted to dance with her. I didn't say much about it at first, especially since some of her female cousins and friends asked me to dance as well. I danced with them, holding them close but being careful not to cross any lines. Maren, on the other hand, was outright flirting, something she tends to do when she drinks. Her cousin told me that Maren had always been like that and that it didn't mean anything, but it still bothered me. I enjoyed dancing with Kathy, though. She was one of those people I genuinely liked being around. I made sure not to do anything inappropriate, but I liked holding her in my arms. During a slow dance with Marin, I told her I didn't approve of her behavior. She called me a party pooper and said she would dance with whoever she wanted, however she wanted. After that, I stopped dancing and started drinking more, all the while watching Marin. I saw her being groped repeatedly by some of the guys she was dancing with. She would rub her body against them and then look at me and laugh. I never laughed back. There were 3 men in particular who were getting too close to her. 2 were old high school friends, and the 3rd was a friend of theirs. I had never seen Marin act this wild before. I went up to her again and told her to cut it out or we'd leave. She told me she was having fun and that if I wanted to leave, I should go without her because she wasn't going anywhere. Frustrated, I walked to the back wall and stood out of the way, watching her. I was getting more and more upset. It was getting late, and some of the partygoers were starting to leave. I figured it was finally over and hoped I could move past it. I went to the restroom to take a much-needed break. When I came back out, Marin was gone. I looked all over for her and even asked a couple of her cousins if they had seen her. That's when I noticed 2 of the guys she had been dancing with earlier hanging around near the exit. One of the guys told me that Marin's old schoolmate, Rob, had taken her up to her room because she was drunk and out of it. They laughed, but I didn't find it funny at all. I headed up to our room, but when I walked in, she wasn't there. Panic set in. I started worrying that Rob had taken her to his room instead, but I had no idea which room that might be. Our room was on the 3rd floor, so I went down to the front desk and asked what rooms her friends were staying in. The clerk told me they were on the 1st floor, facing the pool with rooms that had 2-door entrances. I walked down the hall and saw the 2 guys I talked to earlier about Marin getting ready to enter their room. They must have been rooming together. As they saw me walking by, they looked back, laughed, and disappeared into their room. I continued down the hall, and that's when I heard a woman's voice. I immediately recognized it as Marin's. I banged on the door, and one of the guys opened it. As soon as the door swung open, I could see Marin lying on her knees across the bed with her back in the air. Rob was behind her, having sex with her. "What the hell is going on?" I yelled. But Marin was so into what was happening that she didn't even seem to hear me. Tony, one of the other guys, stepped forward and told me that Marin came in willingly. He said I could either stay and watch or leave, but if I caused any trouble, I'd regret it. He reminded me that there were 3 of them and only one of me. To make matters worse, he pulled out a knife, holding it up as a threat. He was right. One-on-one, I could probably hold my own against any of them, but against all 3, I didn't stand a chance. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then I heard Marin's voice again. "Rob, who's at the door?" she asked. Rob laughed and told her, "It's just Tony and Ben." "Oh my God, Rob, they can see me naked," she exclaimed. Rob laughed again and said, "They're going to do more than just see you. Ben has wanted you for years, and I told him and Tony they could have their turn with you. After all, you've been rubbing your body against them and teasing them all night." Marin didn't say a word. I watched as Ben helped Rob strip off the rest of her clothes and turn her over. Tony stayed close to me, holding the knife to make sure I didn't try anything. I sat down in a chair, completely powerless as one after the other, they had sex with her. To my horror, Marin begged for more, completely enjoying herself. I honestly don't know why I didn't at least try to stop what was happening. Knife or no knife, maybe I could have done something. But the truth is, at that moment, I realized Marin wasn't worth fighting for anymore. She was asking to be with them. She wanted it. And after seeing what I had seen, I just couldn't bring myself to care. When Tony realized I wasn't going to fight back, he joined in with the others. I sat there, feeling like a complete fool. When Tony was finished, he let out a laugh and said, "Damn, she's good." Marin finally sat up, and for the first time, she noticed I was there. "Oh my God, Jim, what are you doing here?" she yelled. Watching my lying wife getting drilled. I snapped. Don't tell me you were forced. I heard you begging for more. I'm sorry, Jim, she stammered. I had too much to drink. Tony and Ben interrupted her. No way, sweetie. You're not going anywhere until we're done with you, Ben said. No, look. You have to let me go, Marin pleaded. This was a mistake. My marriage depends on it. Your marriage is over, I said coldly, cutting her off. The guys laughed, mocking me and calling me weak. I shook my head and walked out the door. They were right. I wasn't going to fight them anymore. Instead, I went back to my room, packed my things, and prepared to leave. I knew my marriage to Marin was over. My problem now wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the humiliation of being made a cuckold. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I wanted revenge, but I also knew I had to bide my time and make sure I didn't get caught. Even though I'd had a lot to drink, I packed up and left the motel, heading home. I figured that when the guys were finished with Marin, she'd eventually go up to our room to sleep it off. She had enough friends and family in the area to figure out how to get home. The next morning at 10 a.m., the phone rang. It was Marin. Jim, how could you just leave me there? I can't believe any man would leave his wife like that. How am I supposed to get home? She yelled. Ask one of your boyfriends. Maybe offer them a BJ or some sex for a ride home. Oh, wait. You already gave them that, didn't you? I shot back. Jim, I'm sorry. It was a mistake. I drank too much and I didn't mean for any of it to happen. They took advantage of me when you left the party, she cried. That's a lie. I didn't leave the party, Marin. I saw everything, I replied. At the party, I went to the restroom, and when I returned, you had left with your old boyfriend. Took me a while to figure out where you were. As for them taking advantage of you, I'll come and get you if you're willing to file sexual assault charges against them and have them arrested. Otherwise, I'll have to assume you were completely willing, and our marriage is over. I can't file charges against them. Everyone will know what happened, she replied. Yeah, right, I said. You were totally willing, and now you're just feeling remorse. By the way, I'm filing for divorce tomorrow on the grounds of adultery. Everyone will know anyway. You can keep the apartment. A couple of my friends and I are moving out. Have a good life. Then I hung up. Marin did make it home later that evening. Her sister, Kathy, drove her back. Meanwhile, I got a storage locker for most of my belongings and rented a room by the week. I didn't need much. That Monday, I went into the lumberyard and quit my job. Marin didn't show up for work that day either, which made things easier for me. I told my boss I was moving out of state and gave him a local post office box to send my final checks and the savings plan I cashed in. I had my pickup truck, which was fully paid off, and went to the bank to withdraw half of the money from our joint savings account. Using the checkbook, I paid off the balance on our credit card, the one in my name. After that, I was out of any debt I had helped incur. I left the checkbook with the bank and asked them to give it to Marin when she came in. Over the next few days, I tried to figure out my next steps. After receiving my share of the money, I had about $2,000 from our joint savings and checking accounts. In a week, I would also receive $115,000 from my job savings plan, plus another $2,000 from my final paycheck and vacation pay. I contacted a lawyer and filed for divorce. The lawyer told me I'd need names and proof if I wanted to file on the grounds of adultery. My other option was a dissolution of marriage, but I wanted everyone to know about Marin's infidelity. The lawyer sent the divorce papers to Marin, making it clear that I didn't want to speak with her directly and that she should contact him if she had any questions. I also bought a cell phone and gave the number to my mom and my lawyer. No one else had my number. I remembered there was a lumberyard in West Virginia, just across the Ohio border, where I had met the owner a few times at company meetings. He had told me to look him up if I ever needed a job. I never thought I'd actually take him up on it, but I arranged a meeting with him. I explained that I needed a job because of my divorce and that my wife worked for my old employer. He promised not to tell anyone at my previous company that I was working for him and said I could start the following Monday. I found a trailer for sale at a reasonable price in a local trailer park. Came furnished, so I didn't need to buy much. I picked up my belongings from storage and moved in. One morning, I stopped at a Bob Evans restaurant outside of Steubenville and couldn't believe my waitress was Kathy, my soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law. She looked angry when she saw me. "Why did you leave Mary?" she asked. "You were upset because she danced with her old boyfriends and then left her at the wedding? When she went to your room, you were gone, and she had no way to get home. I had to drive her back the next day, and by then you had already moved out. How could you do such a thing? I never thought you'd act like that." I could tell Kathy had been fed Marin's version of the story. "Most of what you heard isn't true," I told her. "I don't have time to explain everything right now, but if you want to know the truth, give me a call, and we can meet up. I'll tell you everything." I also told Kathy that her sister was a lying cheat. I could see that Kathy was surprised by my words. I had never spoken like that in front of her before. I gave Kathy my phone number and asked her not to give it to Marin. For some reason, I felt I could trust her. After breakfast, I headed over to my new job. The only people who knew where I was working were Kathy and my lawyer. It was ironic that I was now living and working just 15 miles from Marin's hometown of Steubenville. To my surprise, Kathy called me the very next day. She told me she worked mornings at the restaurant and attended nursing school in the afternoons. She agreed to meet me for dinner at a restaurant in West Virginia after her classes. Kathy said she wanted the truth because she didn't feel she was getting it from Marin. Needless to say, Marin had convinced everyone else that my jealousy had broken up our marriage. I stayed in touch with my lawyer, who reminded me that I needed the full names and addresses of the men who had been with Marin. All I knew were their first names: Ben, Tony, and Rob. I hoped Kathy might be able to help me when we met for dinner. When we sat down for dinner, I could tell Kathy wasn't in the best mood. She told me she had spoken to Marin, who claimed I was trying to divorce her on the grounds of adultery, and that my accusations were completely unfounded. As we ordered, I assured Kathy I would be completely honest with her. I had no reason to lie. I began explaining everything, starting with Marin's behavior at the wedding. Kathy agreed that Marin had been overdoing the flirting and even admitted Marin herself had acknowledged it. Then, I told Kathy the rest of the story. How I went to the restroom at the reception, came back to find Marin missing, and eventually learned from Tony and Ben that Rob had taken her to my room. When I arrived at the room and didn't find her, I searched and found her in Rob's room with his friends, all of them having sex with her. She didn't even notice I was there at first. "How could you just sit there and watch them having sex with Mary?" Kathy asked. "I can't believe you just sat there and did nothing." I explained that I was in shock when I first walked in and saw what was happening. Marin was begging them to continue, and Tony had a knife. He told me it was 3 against 1 and that I didn't stand a chance if I caused trouble. I told Kathy that if Marin had been assaulted, I would have fought them no matter what, but the truth was the sex had been completely consensual. When Marin finally noticed me, she told them to stop and claimed it had all been a mistake. I called her a 304 wife, a not-so-subtle insult, and told her I was leaving and filing for divorce. I packed my things and was gone before Kathy brought her home the next day. "I swear to God, Kathy, that's the absolute truth," I said. "I would never lie to you. I care for you too much." I even told Marin I'd pick her up from the motel if she filed sexual assault charges against them, but she refused. Kathy stared at me for what felt like forever. I could see her searching my eyes for the truth. Finally, She broke the silence. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Kathy, I need the last names and addresses of Rob, Tony, and Ben. Would you be able to get that information for me?" She looked away for a few seconds before responding. "What do you want with them?" "I need their information for my divorce statement. My lawyer told me I need it to file for adultery." "Do you know what you're asking?" she replied. "Maren is my sister, and you want me to betray her by siding with you." "No, that's not true. All I'm asking for is the full names and addresses of the men who had sex with my wife. You can't betray her if she didn't do anything wrong. Can you?" "Kathy, I know you well enough to know that I'm telling the truth. I could still find the information on my own, but it would take longer, and I know you already know their names. More than anything, I just want us to stay friends." Kathy hesitated but eventually agreed. "Okay, I'll get you what you want," she said. "But I have to tell you, I don't know if I totally believe you. Stop by the restaurant on Thursday when I'm working. I'll have it for you." On Thursday, I stopped by the restaurant and asked to sit in Kathy's section. I thought I saw her smile slightly when she saw me. When she came to my table, she slipped me a folded piece of paper, which I quickly put into my pocket. I thanked her and ordered breakfast. Later that day, I met with my lawyer and handed him a copy of the information Kathy had given me. That's when he told me Maren had contacted him. She said she wouldn't sign the divorce papers if they stated the grounds were adultery. However, she was willing to agree to a dissolution of marriage due to irreconcilable differences. She claimed it had to do with protecting her reputation. My lawyer told me this was my best option. The problem was that I didn't have any proof to support my allegations of adultery. I had no witnesses besides myself, and the 3 men involved would surely never admit to what happened. There were no photos, no videos, nothing to prove my story. It was just my word against hers. Begrudgingly, I agreed to proceed with the dissolution. My lawyer said it would be finalized in about 4 months. Then came more bad news. Since I was listed on the lease for our apartment, I'd be responsible for paying half the rent for the next 2 months until the lease expired. After that, I could be removed from the rental agreement. At least I was ridding myself of a lying wife, but it wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. I was made a cuckold and just sat there, taking it. Looking back, I realized I should have walked out instead of watching Maren and listening to her tell them how good it felt. I also remember Rob asking her if it was as good as it used to be. I felt crushed when she said yes. Now, Maren gets to be the one people believe, while I'm seen as nothing more than a jealous husband. My lawyer and Kathy are the only 2 people I've told the whole truth to. I thought the details would come out during the divorce, but since it ended up being a dissolution, it didn't. I did tell a few friends and coworkers that my wife had cheated on me, but I never shared the details. It was already bad enough that I was betrayed. Worse still to admit that I stayed and watched it happen. Over the following months, I threw myself into work and made a habit of visiting Kathy at the restaurant whenever I could. She had given me her work schedule, and even though it meant driving an extra 15 miles, I didn't care. I enjoyed seeing her, even if it was just for a few minutes while she worked. One day I asked Kathy out. She told me she would love to go out with me, but only after the divorce was finalized. No one in her family knew we were seeing each other, even though it was limited to brief conversations at her work. One day when I stopped by, I could tell Kathy was upset. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me something that hit me hard. "Maren is dating Rob again," she said. "It's only been 2 months since you separated, and she's already back with him. Isn't Rob married?" I asked. "He is," Kathy replied. She then told me about a day when she went to see Maren and found Rob at my old apartment. When Maren answered the door, she was wearing nothing but a robe, her hair a mess. Rob was buttoning his shirt as he came out of the bedroom. Kathy didn't even go inside. She told me she called Marin a 304, a not-so-subtle insult, and said she didn't deserve me. Marin's only response was, "Don't tell Mom and Dad." That was when Kathy said she knew everything I had told her was probably true. "I'm sorry for doubting you," she added. By now, it had been over 3.5 months since I filed for the divorce. One evening, Kathy called me, sounding nervous. She said she needed to see me, so we arranged to meet after her classes. I was just happy to see her. We met in a quiet lounge outside of the city, sat in a booth and ordered drinks. "Okay, what's going on?" I asked. "You seemed nervous on the phone." "Marin's pregnant," Kathy said. "I heard her tell Mom last night." I froze. "She told your mom that I'm the father, didn't she?" "Yes," Kathy admitted. "That's impossible. We haven't been together for over 5 months. How far along is she?" "She told Mom she's about 3.5 months pregnant," Kathy replied. "It must have happened around the time you left her." "Are you sure?" "It can't possibly be mine," I said firmly. "I'm positive, but I know this is going to complicate your dissolution," Kathy said apologetically. I was furious. "Damn it. I'm sorry. I know she's your sister, but I hate her for what she's done. All I can say is that I married the wrong sister." "What?" Kathy asked, surprised. "If Marin hadn't gotten pregnant, I wouldn't have married her," I confessed. "You see, I had a crush on you, but I wanted to do the right thing by Marin when she told me she was pregnant. So I married her. I know now that she never loved me, but I gave it my all. And now I can't even be sure the first baby was mine, knowing she was sleeping around." Kathy sat there in silence, clearly shocked by my confession. After a long pause, she finally said, "Why didn't you ever say anything to me?" "I thought it was best to keep it to myself," I admitted. "Besides, I didn't know how you felt, and it wouldn't have changed anything. It would have just made everything more uncomfortable for both of us. I wanted to make my marriage work, but I guess your sister had other ideas." "I'm sorry, Kathy. I really am." "I liked you too," Kathy said quietly. "I always thought about how lucky Marin was to have you." Kathy looked away, then stood up abruptly. "I have to leave now. Please don't let anyone know I told you about Marin. I just thought you should know. I'm sure she'll bring it up in a couple of weeks at your dissolution hearing. I can't see you before then, except if you come into the restaurant." Before she left, she gave me a hug, and I saw tears in her eyes. She handed me a piece of paper with her work schedule for the next month. Maybe she still wanted to see me after all. I knew it was hard for her, knowing how Marin was lying to her parents and that Kathy and I had been in communication all this time. I continued to stop by the restaurant for breakfast whenever I knew Kathy was working. We only had a few minutes to talk each time, but it was always nice seeing her. Then, I got a call from my lawyer about our court appearance. He mentioned that Marin had claimed she was pregnant and was now asking for financial support. She showed up at the dissolution closing with her attorney, but I told them we had already agreed on a settlement, and I wasn't paying her anything more. When her attorney brought up the baby, I flatly stated, "The baby isn't mine, and I'm not giving her a penny." Marin's job would cover most of the baby's costs, so I wasn't worried financially, but I knew the baby wasn't mine. Still, I had an idea. I told her attorney I'd sign an addendum to the dissolution agreement stating that if the child turned out to be mine, I would pay half of all medical bills and child support until the child turned 18. I also agreed to pay for a DNA test at the time of the baby's birth. However, if the child wasn't mine, she wouldn't get a penny from me. Marin screamed at me, but her attorney told her it was a fair offer and advised her to take it. Begrudgingly, she agreed. We signed the addendum, and my marriage was officially over. As we signed the final papers, I looked at Marin with disdain and said, "By the way, I know you're still sleeping with your old boyfriend, Rob. You might want to tell him he's going to be a daddy." She gave me a stunned look, her face screaming, "How do you know that?" But I didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. I just walked out a free man. Even so, in my gut, I knew I didn't feel avenged. What I had done wasn't enough. Real revenge was still on my mind, and it was time to make a plan. Part of me thought I should just let it all go and move on, but something inside me wouldn't allow it. My anger and humiliation gnawed at me, urging me to act. The next time I saw Kathy, I mentioned that I'd told Marin I knew she was sleeping with Rob and that she might want to tell him he was going to be a father. "God, Jim, you didn't tell her I told you, did you?" Kathy asked. "No," I assured her. "I just blurted it out. No one except the guys at work knows I even come here to see you." I then asked, "I'm divorced now, so can we finally get together?" "Jim, this is a really busy time for me," Kathy said. "I'm working, I have school, and finals are coming up. I'm graduating with a nursing degree in a few months. Plus, there's the big issue of my family. They still blame you for the divorce and for Marin getting pregnant again. Maybe someday I can explain everything to them and they'll understand differently, but right now isn't the best time. Please try to understand. I'm not avoiding you. I really want to be with you, but the timing has to be right." Due to her schedule, I could only see Kathy twice a week for breakfast. I told her I'd wait as long as she needed me to. In the meantime, I decided it was time to start getting even. I managed to gather more information on the 3 scumbags who had slept with Marin. Kathy had unknowingly provided their home addresses, though she had no idea I was planning to use them for revenge. My first target was Tony, the guy who had sex with Marin while holding a knife on me, laughing at my humiliation. I couldn't forget that night, and now it was my turn to make him pay. I followed Tony a couple of times to a bar near where he lived. It was a mixed crowd but predominantly Hispanic, and he often parked his motorcycle in the back to avoid any trouble. He usually went there on Saturday nights but occasionally stopped by during the week, staying for about an hour each time. I bided my time, waiting for the perfect opportunity. One late Wednesday night, I followed Tony to the bar. It was a slow night, cold, dreary, and dark. I parked my truck in a lot next to the bar and waited for him to come out. Around midnight, he finally left. The parking lot was empty, and he didn't notice me as he walked to his bike. As he started his motorcycle, I slipped on a cold weather mask, grabbed a baseball bat from my truck, and approached him quietly from behind. He didn't hear me coming. I swung the bat hard, hitting him across the small of his back. He screamed in pain and tried to turn around, but I swung again, hitting his arms as he raised them to protect his head. His helmet was on, but the force of the blows rattled him. I swung one last time, striking his ribs. He fell off his bike and hit the pavement, groaning in pain. He was still conscious but barely. Without saying a word, I ran back to my truck and drove off, making sure no one had seen me. It was a stupid thing to do, I admit, but sometimes emotions override reason. The next day, the incident was in the local paper. The report said a man had been beaten behind the bar, but there were no witnesses and no suspects. I knew no one would suspect me. After all, it had been nearly 5 months since Tony slept with Marin, and the incident was never mentioned in court. In a way, the dissolution had worked in my favor. As much as I wanted Tony to know it was me, I knew it was better this way. If he had known, it could have caused a whole new set of problems down the road. The next time I stopped by the restaurant for breakfast, Kathy brought up the attack. "Did you read about Tony getting beaten up?" she asked. "Yeah, I saw it in the paper," I said casually. "But I don't know much about the area." She smiled faintly. "I guess it's karma. I'm happy he got what he deserved. Some other husband getting even with him. That's what I told Kathy when she mentioned Tony had been beaten up. She stared at me for a moment but didn't ask if I was involved. And honestly, that was a relief. I wouldn't have wanted to lie to her. Still, I got some satisfaction from what I'd done. Too bad Tony didn't know it was me, but it was better that way. It could have caused long-term problems if he had found out. According to the reports, he was in the hospital for a week with multiple bruises and fractures. He had no idea who attacked him, thanks to the mask I wore and the fact that I'd used gloves. With Tony taken care of, it was now time to go after Rob. Since Rob was married, I figured revenge might be a little easier to achieve. Thanks to Kathy's information, I knew that Rob often went to see Maren on Saturdays. He probably told his wife he was working or hanging out with friends, giving him the whole day to spend with Maren. I decided to confront his wife, Sheila, directly. Around noon on a Saturday, I went to Rob's house. Sheila answered the door, and I could see two small children playing and yelling in the living room behind her. "Can I help you?" Sheila asked. "My name is Jim Holder," I said. "I'm not quite sure how to say this, but your husband is having an affair with my ex-wife." She looked shocked. "What? Who are you again? Who's your ex-wife? And why are you telling me this?" "I'm Jim Holder. My ex-wife is Maren Jennings Holder. She was in your high school class," I explained. She narrowed her eyes. "I know who she is, the witch. How do you know Rob is sleeping with her?" She stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her so her kids wouldn't hear. "We were at a wedding a few months ago, and I caught them having sex," I said. At the time, I didn't know if it was just a one-time thing, but after hearing she'd been with him before, I divorced her. Now I find out she's still seeing him, and she's pregnant. I believe Rob is the father because I know for sure that I'm not. Sheila stared at me. "Why should I believe you? I don't even know you. You show up at my house while my husband is supposedly at work and accuse him of screwing his old girlfriend. Sounds like you're just out for revenge." "I do want revenge," I admitted. "But it's the truth. Your husband isn't at work today. He's with Maren at her apartment, 40 miles away. He goes there most weekends. I can prove it to you." "How?" Sheila asked, skeptical. "I'll call Maren right now and ask to speak to Rob. I'll put it on speaker so you can hear the whole conversation." "Is there any reason why Rob should be at her apartment?" "Hell no," Sheila replied. "Wait here while I grab my phone." She went inside and returned with her phone. She handed it to me and turned on the speaker. I dialed Maren's number, and she answered after a couple of rings. "Maren, this is Jim," I said. "What the hell do you want?" She snapped. "I know your lover, Rob, is there, and I need to talk to him." "Put him on," I demanded. "He's not here," she lied. "You lying 304. I said. "I can hear him talking in the background. Hand him the damn phone." After a moment of hesitation, Maren handed the phone to Rob. I gave Sheila the phone so she could hear everything. "What the hell do you want, you pervert? Want to watch me screw your ex-wife again?" Rob said, laughing. Sheila yelled, "You creep! So you're back to sleeping with your 304s again? Well, I've got news for you. You can just stay there, we're through. And just to get even with your cheating, I'm gonna screw Jim. Two can play this game." Rob started stammering, trying to come up with excuses, but Sheila cut him off. "Go to hell, Rob. You're a lying, cheating creep, and I'm filing for divorce." She hung up the phone and turned to me. "Just so you know, I'm not actually going to sleep with you. I only said that to get even with him. I have 2 kids to raise, and between my job and the alimony I'll get from Rob, I'll be fine." She actually thanked me for telling her the truth. "If Rob ever asks you if we slept together, feel free to say yes. But in court I'll tell the truth. I never did. If you're willing, I might need you as a witness in the divorce case. I told her I'd be happy to testify if needed. As I left, I felt both good and bad. I got my revenge on Rob, but I hurt Sheila and broke up her marriage in the process. Sheila admitted that she had long suspected Rob was cheating on her, but never had any solid evidence until now. I couldn't help but wonder why Rob would cheat with someone like Maren when he had a nice-looking wife like Sheila and 2 kids at home who loved him. Some guys are just born a-holes. Rob was one of those guys who still thought he was a stud because he'd been an athlete in high school. He needed to grow up. Sheila kicked him out shortly afterward. He couldn't move in with Maren because it was too far from his work. Kathy told me that Maren deserved everything coming to her, but her parents were shocked when they learned Rob had cheated on his wife, Sheila, with Maren. After being kicked out of his house, Rob moved in temporarily with Ben and his mother. Ben had been divorced a couple of years earlier, his wife left him for another man, and he moved back in with his mother after that. I later found out that Ben's mom had been divorced since Ben was a teenager, and she pretty much raised him alone. Like many of us, he came from a single-parent household. His mom worked as a bartender at a neighborhood bar, but she had one rule. She didn't want Ben coming in as a customer because it made her uncomfortable to watch him drink the way his father had. She didn't seem to mind Rob moving in temporarily until he could find his own place. In case you're wondering, I got most of this information from casual conversations with Kathy when I stopped in for breakfast. Maren was getting bigger, and according to Kathy, she was due to have the baby in about a month. Kathy also told me that Rob wasn't the kind of guy who could take care of himself. He always needed a woman to take care of him. One weekend, Maren brought Rob along to visit her parents. According to Kathy, Rob turned on the charm and fed them a sob story, claiming that he and Sheila had been having problems for a long time. He said that seeing Maren at the wedding reminded him how much he cared for her, and after I filed for divorce, they reconnected. Rob spun a web of lies, saying that he and Maren had grown close again and that he'd even proposed to her. He told them they planned to marry after the baby was born and once his divorce was finalized. They were looking for a place near Steubenville so Maren and the baby could be close to her parents. Rob also told them he'd been promoted at the mill, meaning Maren wouldn't have to work if she didn't want to. He even claimed he'd be a good father to the baby, even though it wasn't his. Maren's parents bought every word, welcoming Rob into the family. Kathy said she couldn't believe the nonsense they were spewing, but bit her tongue to avoid an argument. She had always been the opposite of Maren, level-headed and straightforward, while Maren could do no wrong in her parents' eyes. Despite all of this, I still wanted to be with Kathy. But between her job, her nursing classes, and helping out at the hospital as a nurse's aide, she was always busy. She assured me her time would come, and I trusted her. One day, after work, I went to a bar with 4 friends. I couldn't believe it when I saw Rob and Ben sitting there. I debated whether to avoid them or confront them, but Rob made the decision for me. "Hey, Jim," he called out. "I'm screwing your old lady again. You screwed up my marriage, but at least I still have your ex to drill." They started laughing. I clenched my fists but kept my composure. "So, you're screwing a pregnant 304 who gave it up to your friends. Aren't you the lucky one?" I shot back. "Why don't we step outside and settle this like men? Or are you afraid of going one-on-one?" Rob smirked. "Right now it's 2 against 4, so I think the odds are in your favor. But the minute I beat you up, your friends will jump in." "You mean the way you had it 3-1 at the wedding?" I retorted. "Stay the hell away from Sheila and my kids if you know what's good for you." Rob sneered. "I don't need a ready-made family. You can support them. Sheila is one nice woman, not like the 304 I was married to." "Looks to me like you hitched your wagon to the wrong horse," I said before walking away. My friends and I moved to a booth and ordered some beers. Rob and Ben kept looking over, talking among themselves like they wanted to jump me. I was ready to take either one of them, as long as it was one-on-one. I got up to grab another round of beers, and on my way back, Ben called me a cuck. I stopped and stared at him. "You're next on my list," I said calmly before returning to my table. I knew they had to be wondering if I was the one who beat up Tony months ago, but there was no proof. Ben tried to laugh it off. "Hey man, I've got no wife or sisters to drill and no marriage to mess up. What are you going to do? Screw my old lady." He laughed again, but I ignored him and sat down. Still, I couldn't help but admit that Ben's comment gave me an idea. My friends reassured me that they'd have my back if anything ever went down. We finished our drinks and left the bar without incident. The following Saturday night, I decided to visit a bar I'd never been to before. A small, neighborhood place with only about a dozen customers. Everyone stared at me when I walked in, probably because they all knew each other and I was a stranger. I sat at the end of the bar and ordered a beer. The bartender was an older woman, probably in her mid-40s, and she looked familiar. As I glanced around, I realized she was Ben's mother. Helen was in her late 40s, and though she was starting to show her age, she still had a youthful energy about her. She had a few visible tattoos, and when she set down my beer, she asked if I wanted anything else. It was after midnight, but I asked if it was possible to get something to eat. "The cook's gone, but I can rustle you up a ham sandwich if you like," she said. "That would be great. I haven't eaten much today," I replied. She smiled and went back to the kitchen to make it. It was a simple sandwich with ham, mayo, lettuce, tomato, and cheese, but it hit the spot. I also grabbed a bag of chips to go with it. Within an hour, most of the customers had left. Only 2 couples remained, sitting in a booth near the back. Helen was cleaning off the bar and came over to talk to me. "You new here? Where are you from?" she asked. "I recently got divorced and moved to West Virginia. I work at the lumberyard. I was riding through town and saw this place, so I decided to stop for a beer and a bite to eat," I explained. "I'm Helen," she said with a smile. "I've been here for 15 years. We don't get many young guys like you in here. They usually want to pick up some young chick. And we don't get many of those either," she added with a playful grin. "We're just a small-town community bar." "I could use a small-town vibe right now," I said, laughing. "It's been a while since the divorce." Helen wasn't bad-looking. She wore a low-cut blouse that revealed some nice cleavage. She wasn't overweight, in fact, she was on the thinner side. I started kidding around with her, and she flirted back. We talked for a while, and she eventually told me her son had moved back in with her, and now his a-hole friend was living with them temporarily. "He's going through a divorce too. Must be something in the water," she said with a chuckle. "My ex did a gangbang, and I caught her in the middle of it," I said bluntly. "I walked out and never looked back." "Damn, honey, sorry to hear that," Helen said sympathetically. She was personable and easy to talk to. As the conversation went on, I decided to take a chance. "Helen, what are you doing after work?" I asked. She smiled. "Are you really trying to pick me up?" "Mothers like sex too," I replied with a smirk. Helen laughed. "I'm old enough to be your mother, honey." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm just passing through. We'll probably never see each other again." Helen gave me a coy smile before walking away to take care of the last customers in the booth. She told them it was last call, and when she came back to the bar, she leaned in close. "Look," she said softly, "it's been a while for me too, since I've been with a young man like you. I have to finish cleaning up and restocking the bar, and then we can go somewhere." I didn't hesitate. I got up and started helping her restock the bar, and she smiled when she saw me pitching in. After the last couple left, we finished cleaning up, and I mentioned the small room in the back. "I saw the couch and bed back there earlier," I said. "It's for passed-out drunks and the like. Haven't had many of those lately. I've slept there a few times myself when I had too much to drink and didn't want to drive home," Helen explained. She led me to the back room, shutting off 2 cameras along the way. I asked her what they were for. "One's for the main bar, and the other's for the back room. Can't be too careful these days. But don't worry, we won't be on video," she said with a laugh. She went to freshen up in the bathroom while I swapped out the disc in the back room's camera, inserting a blank one before turning it back on. Helen came out of the restroom and said, "Let's see what you've got, honey." We kissed, deep and passionate, like 2 people who had been starved for affection. Within minutes, we were both naked, and she was on her back. I'd never been with an older woman before, but Helen clearly knew what she was doing. She had tattoos above her chest and below her belly, and her experience showed. I drilled her hard, and she screamed out how good it felt. "That was so good. God, you're good," Helen said breathlessly as she got up and went to the bathroom. I used the restroom after her, and when I came back, Helen was naked and asleep on the couch. I covered her with a sheet, turned off the camera, and swapped the original disc back in. Then I left through the back door, which self-locked behind me. Now it was time to deal with Rob and Ben again. The following Saturday, I stopped by Bob Evans, where Kathy was working. I sat in her section, and since it wasn't as crowded as usual, we had a chance to talk. My feelings for her were strong, but there wasn't much I could do about it. As I was ordering my breakfast, I noticed Kathy looking up at another customer. My back was to them, so I had no idea who it was, until I heard a familiar voice. "Screw Kathy. I didn't know they served losers here. Cucks in here. If you need a man, just let me know and I'll fix you up with a real one. No need to walk around with this a-hole," said the voice. I recognized it immediately. It was Rob. Kathy looked scared, but she didn't say anything. Everything happened in a flash. I jumped up from my booth, turned around, and cold-cocked Rob with a right cross. He hit the floor hard. That's when I noticed Marin sitting at the table with him, her pregnant belly visible as she screamed. She must have been due any day now. I didn't stop. I jumped on Rob and hit him again. Sure, I'd broken his jaw. His nose was bleeding, and Marin was screaming for me to stop. Kathy pleaded with me too, and finally I listened. I stood up, breathing heavily, as 2 police officers who were eating breakfast nearby grabbed me. They called for an ambulance for Rob and walked me out in cuffs. I looked back and saw both Marin and Kathy crying. I had to wonder who was crying for whom. The officers took me to jail and I called my lawyer. He said I would be arraigned on Monday on assault charges. Since the hearing was only a couple of days away, it wasn't worth posting bail. I'd be spending Saturday and Sunday in lockup, giving me plenty of time to think. I thought about my messed-up childhood, marrying a 304, and falling in love with her sister. Jail gives you a lot of time to think about what could have been. I figured Kathy wouldn't want to talk to me anymore. Still, if I didn't end up serving serious time, maybe somehow I could start over with her if she'd have me. Despite everything, I couldn't get Kathy out of my mind. I'd never even kissed her the way you would kiss a girlfriend, but my feelings for her were real. Monday morning came and I was arraigned first thing. Before that, I called my boss to let him know I wouldn't be at work. I told him why, and he asked me to call again after the arraignment to let him know when I'd be back. I knew if I had to serve real time, I'd probably lose my job. The courtroom was small and crowded. Rob was there with his face bruised, his jaw wired shut, and Marin sitting next to him. She was staring daggers at me, her pregnant belly making her look even angrier. Behind them were Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, Kathy and Marin's parents, who were also glaring at me like I just insulted their entire family. On my side, just me and my lawyer, Mr. Williams. I wondered why Kathy wasn't there. She was a prime witness to what happened. The two patrolmen who had arrested me were present as well. They didn't say much when I was in the cruiser except to complain about me ruining their breakfast. The judge entered and called the court to order. He explained that this was an arraignment to determine whether I would be formally charged with assault and proceed to a criminal trial. The atmosphere was somewhat relaxed, but the judge clearly ran a tight courtroom. Mr. Williams, the judge began, you said you have a witness who could explain this entire situation your client finds himself in. Since Mr. Rob Avery is unable to speak at this time, I would like to hear from this witness. Kathy walked into the courtroom. Everyone seemed shocked to see her, especially the Jennings family. She didn't look at me or her parents as she went straight to the witness stand. A clerk swore her in. Miss Jennings, the judge said, please tell us what you observed on the morning in question. Kathy took a deep breath. Well, sir, I'm a waitress at the restaurant. Jim, that's Mr. Holder, comes in regularly and usually sits in my section, as he did that morning. While we were talking, I saw Rob Avery and my sister, Marin, come in. They started walking toward my section. The woman sitting next to Mr. Avery is your sister, I presume? The judge asked. Yes, Kathy replied. And Mr. Avery is her fiancé. They're supposed to be married in a couple of months. I could see Kathy was nervous. She avoided looking at me, her parents, or anyone else in the room. Go on, Miss Jennings. What happened next? Asked the judge. Jim's back was to Mr. Avery. He didn't see who it was until he turned around. I'm sure he recognized Rob's voice when he heard it, Kathy explained. What did Mr. Avery say to the defendant? The judge asked. Kathy hesitated, then said, he actually said it more to me than to Jim. I think that's what made Jim so angry. Jim has been called names by Rob plenty of times, but this time, Rob insulted me too. That's when Jim retaliated by hitting him. He did more than just hit him, he broke his jaw. What exactly did Mr. Avery say? The judge pressed. Kathy took a deep breath. He called Jim a cuck and said that if I wanted to screw around, he'd find me a real man, not one who lets other men sleep with his wife. I glanced at the Jennings family. They looked mortified. Marin stared at me with disdain, while her parents glared at Kathy as if she had betrayed them. The judge nodded. I see. And what happened after Mr. Holder struck Mr. Avery? Jim turned and punched him again while he was on the floor. I asked him to stop, and he did. Kathy continued. Jim jumped up, turned around, and socked Rob. He went down, and Jim called him an a-hole before hitting him again. I yelled for Jim to stop, and he did. That's when the officers came over, arrested Jim, and called paramedics to help Rob Avery. The judge thought for a moment and asked Kathy, what brought all this on? And why did Mr. Avery call Mr. Holder this name? This seems to be the basis of the case. Do you have any idea why, Miss Jennings? Yes, sir, Kathy replied. Jim told me it all started at my cousin's wedding nearly 9 months ago. Jim said he saw my sister, Marin, having sex with 3 men, and he said it was consensual. Marin immediately stood up and shouted, That's not true. The judge turned to her. Mrs. Holder, what part isn't true? Did you or did you not have sex that night with someone other than your husband? Marin just started crying and sat back down without answering. The judge didn't wait. He turned to Rob and said, Mr. Avery, I know it's hard for you to talk, but all you have to do is nod your head. Remember, you are in a court of law and you are under oath. If you perjure yourself, you could be arrested. Now, did you have sexual relations with Mrs. Holder that night? Rob nodded. The judge said, the record should reflect Mr. Avery's affirmative response. Then he added, Did anyone else also have relations with Mrs. Holder that night? Rob hesitated, glancing at Marin, then back at the judge. After a moment, he nodded again. The judge repeated, "The record should reflect Mr. Avery's affirmative response." At this point, Mr. and Mrs. Jennings started to get up and leave the courtroom, but the judge firmly told them to stay seated until the hearing was over. "Thank you, Miss Jennings," the judge said. "You've been most helpful. You may be seated." Kathy looked uncertain about where to sit and eventually sat with her parents, who were clearly not happy with her testimony. Marin was still crying but didn't say a word. The judge asked the officers if they had anything to add. One of them replied, "Just what Miss Jennings stated, Your Honor. We called the ambulance for Mr. Avery and helped Mrs. Holder, who was pregnant, to her vehicle. The defendant didn't speak the entire time we transported him." The judge nodded and then turned to Marin. "Mrs. Holder, is there anything you would like to add? This hearing is to determine whether to drop the charges against Mr. Holder or proceed with an assault charge." Marin shook her head. "No, Your Honor. I'm sorry for what happened," she said softly but didn't elaborate. The judge leaned back in his chair, addressing Rob. "Mr. Avery, it seems this incident was caused by your badgering of the defendant, who retaliated in kind. I'm not saying Mr. Holder isn't responsible for your medical bills, but as I understand it, your insurance covered all but $200 of your expenses. Is that correct?" Rob nodded again. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Holder, please stand." I stood, heart pounding. "I understand your retaliation, but you can't go around hitting people just because you don't like what they say about you or your girlfriend. You are responsible for Mr. Avery's unpaid medical bills in the amount of $200, which must be paid within 1 week. Additionally, I'm putting you on 6 months probation for fighting in a public place. If you appear in my courtroom again for fighting or any other disturbance, you will serve the remainder of the 6 months plus any additional sentences for your actions. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. "Thank you. I'll do my best to stay out of trouble." The judge banged his gavel and the hearing was over. Rob and Marin left the courtroom, while Kathy turned to her parents. "I was raised by you to always tell the truth," she told them, "and that's exactly what I did." She didn't mention Marin's behavior at the wedding, as Marin had asked her to keep quiet, and she knew her parents wouldn't believe me over Marin anyway. They glared at her briefly before turning their furious expressions on me. Kathy gave me a small, sad smile, but her parents stormed out of the courtroom without another word. After the hearing, my lawyer pulled me aside. "You owe Kathy big time," he said. "I know," I replied. There was no doubt about that. I called my boss and told him I'd be back to work on Tuesday. He seemed relieved that he wouldn't have to fire me. I worked the rest of the week but couldn't stop thinking about Kathy. I didn't have her cell phone number, and I didn't dare call the Jennings house. After the fight, I wasn't allowed back in the restaurant, which meant I couldn't see her there either. One day, I pulled into the restaurant parking lot and saw her through the windows. She noticed me too, but she just looked away and went back to work. It hurt, but I couldn't blame her. On Saturday, I went to the bar by myself. Ben was there with some guy I didn't know. Ben knew what had happened to Rob, but he didn't bring it up. I walked over, tossed a disc onto the table and said, "This is a movie for you to watch. I suggest you don't watch it with anyone else around, including your mother." Ben gave me a weird look but took the disc anyway. The following weekend, I went back to the bar with a couple of friends. Ben was there with a few of his buddies as well. At one point, he came over and asked to speak to me privately. He didn't look happy, and I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't afford to get into another fight. We stepped outside, and Ben immediately confronted me. "You screwed my mother. You a hole. What the hell is the matter with you?" I stayed calm. "Listen, Ben, it was your idea. You said, I'm not married. I've got no girlfriend, no sister. What the hell are you going to do? Screw my old lady? Then you laughed at me. So yeah, I went to see your mom. She's a nice but lonely person, and we spent some time together. As you saw, there are 2 copies of that disc. You have one and I have the other. Mine will stay buried and probably never see the light of day, unless you try something else. Let's not forget, this all started because you slept with my wife before she was my ex. So, do we call it a truce? Or do we keep this going until one of us ends up in the hospital or jail? Ben glared at me for a moment before replying, Promise me you'll never be with my mom again. I can't make that promise, Ben, I said. She doesn't even know my name. She called me honey. It was a one-time thing for both of us. So, do we have a truce? No more name-calling. Ben sighed and extended his hand. Okay, truce. No more name-calling. Good, I said. The first beer's on you. We went back inside, grabbed a few beers together, and talked like adults. I could tell Ben wasn't thrilled, but he let it go for now. Meanwhile, on Marin's front, Rob had officially moved in with her since Ben's mom had kicked him out. Rob wasn't working. He was off for at least 2 months due to his jaw injury, and figured he'd stay with Marin in the meantime. However, Marin had her hands full. Rob wasn't the best housemate and wasn't much help around the house. The following week, I had just gotten home from work when my phone rang. I was surprised to hear Kathy's voice on the other end. Jim, I have a few things to tell you. Do you have a minute? She asked. I have all night, I replied. I wasn't sure I'd ever hear from you again. I'm sorry you had to testify at my hearing. I know it was hard for you. If it weren't for you, I'd probably be in jail right now. Jim, I volunteered to testify on your behalf, Kathy said. All I did was tell the truth. My parents were mad at first, but they realized I did the right thing. So, what do you need to tell me? I asked. Marin had her baby this morning. It's a cute little boy, but, well, I don't think they're going to need your DNA, Kathy said. What do you mean? I asked, confused. The little guy is Hispanic, Kathy replied. What? I exclaimed. So, do you think it was Tony's? Yes, Kathy said. Rob was there when the baby was born. When he saw the baby was mixed, he left the hospital. He said he wasn't going to father a mixed kid. He thought the baby was his, which is why he was going to marry Marin. On the way out, he told my parents the wedding was off. Is Marin going to have Tony tested? I asked. She said maybe, but honestly, I don't think she's sure Tony is the father either. She hasn't said much. Mom and Dad are really pissed at her, but they won't take it out on the baby. It's their first grandchild, and they know it's not his fault. They'd have preferred the baby to be white, but there's nothing they can do about it now. Funny thing is, you're looking a lot better to them than Rob is. They don't want him back in their house. Anything else new? I asked. Like me seeing you? I graduate next week, Kathy said. Want an invitation? Of course. I'd love to be there, I replied. You know my address, so just send it to me. You can pick it up at the restaurant on Wednesday, Kathy said. Kathy, I've been banned from that Bob Evans. I don't want to get arrested. I talked to the owner, Kathy explained. I told him the story and that you were protecting me. Even the 2 cops told him Rob instigated the whole thing. I saw you watching me from outside the restaurant, but you never came in. So, will I see you Wednesday morning? It's my last day at the restaurant. I graduate on Sunday and then have a week off before starting my full-time job at the hospital in the maternity ward. Okay, I said. I'll trust you and come to the restaurant. I hope I don't get locked up. I wouldn't want to miss your graduation. On Wednesday, I went to the restaurant. Kathy gave me a ticket to the graduation and a schedule showing when the nursing graduates would be receiving their diplomas. She explained that the larger colleges had over 1,000 graduates, so they scheduled different degrees in specific time slots. When Sunday came, the parking lot was so packed they had to bus people to the stadium where the ceremony was being held. I arrived at the designated time and found a seat in the stands. I couldn't believe how many graduates there were. Kathy told me she'd be wearing a white cord, but it didn't narrow it down much. As I scanned the crowd, I noticed Mr. and Mrs. Jennings sitting in the next section. To my surprise, Marin was with them, holding her baby in a large basket. Kathy's parents had informed Marin that she would attend her sister's graduation. I was there, but in a sea of graduates, I had no idea how I'd recognize Kathy. When the nursing graduates stood up, they formed a long line to walk across the stage and receive their diplomas. Thankfully, the names were announced over the loudspeakers. As the students were called in alphabetical order, I started listening intently when they reached the J section. Then I heard it, Kathy Elizabeth Jennings. I couldn't help it. Tears started running down my cheeks. I stood up, clapped, whistled, and yelled, "Go, Kathy!" Everyone around me smiled. Then I glanced over at Mr. and Mrs. Jennings. They noticed me cheering for Kathy and, to my surprise, stood up as well and clapped for her. I was so proud of her. Marin looked at me with a somewhat sad expression, but I couldn't dwell on it. My focus was on Kathy. After the ceremony, the program directed attendees to specific areas to meet the graduates. The stadium was packed wall to wall, but I made my way to the designated spot and saw Kathy hugging her parents. She was crying tears of joy. Even Marin hugged her, and Kathy hugged her back. I stood back about 20 feet, not wanting to interrupt her moment with her family. Then, all of a sudden, Kathy looked up, spotted me, and smiled. Without hesitation, she ran toward me, threw her arms around me, and hugged me tightly. For the first time ever, she kissed me. Not just a peck, but a real kiss. Tears were still streaming down her face as she whispered in my ear, "I love you, Jimmy." She only called me Jimmy every now and then, but it always felt special. "I love you too, Kathy Elizabeth Jennings," I replied. We hugged again before she pulled back and said, "My parents are throwing me a party tonight. All my friends and relatives are going to be there. Are you coming?" "I'd love to, but I think I better sit this one out," I said. "I'm not sure your parents would want me there. I'll be there in spirit, though." We hugged one last time before she returned to her family. I headed home, thinking about how some people can bring so much happiness into your life. Kathy was one of those people for me. Later that night, I stopped at a bar for a couple of beers. Funny enough, Ben was there too. We chatted about nothing in particular, and I realized he wasn't such a bad guy after all. I was glad I hadn't beaten him up. After a few beers, it was getting late, so I headed home, relieved that the next day was Sunday and I could sleep in. I couldn't stop thinking about Kathy and her graduation party. I wished I could have been there, but I knew the focus would have shifted to me and possibly Marin, instead of staying on Kathy where it belonged. It was near midnight when I heard a knock on my door. Surprised, I wondered who could be visiting me at this hour. I got up, turned on the light, and answered the door in my briefs. Standing there with the biggest smile on her face was Kathy. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course, but what are you doing here? What about your party?" "It was fun, but everyone's gone home now," she said. "I thought about you, so I grabbed a night bag and decided to come see you. You don't mind, do you?" "Mind? I'm so happy to see you," I exclaimed. "The trailer's a mess, though. I wasn't expecting company." "Do you have clean sheets on the bed?" Kathy asked with a playful smile. "Fairly clean," I admitted. "I changed them 2 days ago. but I've been sleeping on the couch watching TV. I could hardly believe Kathy was standing in my home. I wasn't stupid. I had an idea of what might happen, but I never expected Kathy to come to me like this. Jimmy, she began softly, I might as well just say it. I'm in love with you and I want to make love to you. Her words took my breath away, but she continued before I could respond. I need to tell you a few things first, she said. My parents know I'm here. They're not exactly happy about it, but they said I'm old enough to make my own decisions. They also said they've realized that Marin was the problem, not you. I love you, Kathy. You know that, I replied. Quiet, she said with a smile. Let me finish. She hesitated, then continued. Mom asked if I was on birth control pills, and I told her I started taking them a few months ago when I realized how much I care for you. I also have to tell you, I'm a virgin. I haven't dated much because most guys want the same thing, and I wanted to save myself for the man I love. She paused, looking me straight in the eyes. Jimmy, you'd better be sure of your feelings for me, because if this happens, it's not just one night, it's forever. I took her in my arms and kissed her deeply. I love you, Kathy. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We went into the bedroom, and I slowly undressed her. She was so beautiful, standing there in the dim light. I still had on my briefs, but my erection was straining hard against the fabric. Kathy looked at me with a playful smile. Let it out before it rips your underwear, she teased. We laughed softly, then hugged and kissed, our love radiating through the room. That night, we made love for the first time, and it was everything I had ever dreamed it could be. Later, I got up to use the bathroom, and when I came back, Kathy was awake. She got up to use the bathroom as well and returned to bed with a smile on her face. What's on the agenda for today? I asked. Kathy leaned over, kissed me, and said, First, I want you to make love to me again. Then you can take me out for breakfast. I want the world to know we're officially a couple. We made love again, and afterward we got dressed and went to the Bob Evans where Kathy used to work. We had breakfast together, holding hands and sharing smiles. The staff, many of whom knew us, greeted us warmly. Felt like a fresh start. After breakfast, Kathy took me to her parents' house. We sat down and had a long, heartfelt talk with them. To my surprise, they apologized for the way they had treated me in the past. They admitted they had misjudged me and said they were happy to see how much Kathy cared for me. It felt like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time I felt truly accepted. From that day on, Kathy and I began dating regularly. We decided to take things slow and agreed not to get married for at least a year. Kathy had started her new job at the hospital, and we saw each other at least 4 times a week. We spoke on the phone most days, and she spent many nights at my trailer. We both worked hard and saved money for our future together. Kathy's parents grew warmer toward me as time went on, and I got along with them surprisingly well. Life felt good. I didn't go to the bar very often anymore, but I did run into Ben a few times. One evening, Ben shared some updates about the others. When Tony found out Marin's baby was Hispanic, he took off for parts unknown, Ben told me. No one knows where he went, and he's definitely not about to take a DNA test. Ben himself had turned over a new leaf. He found a girlfriend and had been dating steadily. Rob and Sheila, on the other hand, finalized their divorce, but not before Rob's raise kicked in, meaning he had to pay even more in child support and alimony. I had a feeling he didn't think Marin was worth all the trouble. As for Marin, she was still living in her apartment 40 miles away, raising the baby on her own. She had plenty of friends and managed to keep busy, but it was clear her life wasn't what she'd hoped for. Kathy told me that she and her parents visited Marin occasionally. During one visit, Marin admitted to Kathy that she had made a huge mistake by cheating on me. Marin told me to never make the same mistake she did, Kathy said, recounting the conversation. I told her, it will never happen. You see, I really do love him, and someday I want to have his children. Hearing Kathy say those words filled me with more happiness than I thought was possible. As for us, life couldn't be much better. We were deeply in love, building a future together, and focused on the happiness we shared. And honestly, that's the best revenge. Living a life filled with love, peace, and joy, while those who wronged you are left to deal with the consequences of their choices.